Hi, I'm Paul Stringfellow, and welcome to another CTO Insights vendor special, where we're talking with one of the vendors that we work with often about their view on some particular technology topics. So to help us to do that today, I'm joined by Malcolm Murphy from Mimecast. Hi, Malcolm. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Paul. How are you?
I'm very well, yeah. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And before we jump into our topic, because we're going to be talking about kind of the human face of cybersecurity, before we jump into that, a little bit of an introduction. Tell us who you are, what it is you do over at Mimecast.
So my name is Malcolm Murphy. I run the sales engineering team for Mimecast in the UK and Ireland. What that means is sales engineering, we're a team of people who will work with organizations to identify what their requirements, what their needs are, what problems they're trying to solve, and work out what the appropriate solution to address that is.
Okay, that sounds like a job.
It's a job.
Yeah,
It's not a job I ever thought I'd be doing when I was at school. I don't think anybody grows up and says I want to be a sales engineering director, but it's a fantastic job.
You know, it was our train driver. So
astronaut.
Exactly. I mean, they were the two things out on my list.
Yeah.
Astronaut or CTO who does podcasts occasionally. I mean, it's still time. I could still be an astronaut. If William Shatner can go to space at his age, there's still a chance.
Exactly.
As long as there's still a chance. So we talked very briefly, kind of in the introduction, about this idea of human risk when it comes to cybersecurity and kind of the human elements of it. So maybe before we dive into a bit more detail, do you want to talk a little bit about maybe for the audience, you want to set a little bit of context around what we mean when we talk about human risk? Yeah.
So if you think about, I think about this in sort of these two ways. The cyber adversaries, the bad guys out there, they're trying to get your organization, your people to do something that you don't want to do. And you can break that down now into two pieces. One is, I've got to put something bad in front of you. That might be a phishing email to ask you to go give me your credentials or give me some of the confidential information or get you to go and somewhere or download malware onto your laptop or whatever it might be. So put bad stuff in front of people. But the second part, they need two things to happen. They need that bad thing to get in front of you, and they need you to do something with it. If you don't interact with that bad content, then nothing bad happens, roughly. So the human element of this is working with the humans, people, let's call them people, working with people.
That's a word. Yeah, that's a word for them.
To at the point at which they're incented to make a bad decision, help them make a good decision.
I think that's... I think it's a really interesting little nuance on there when you said, let's stop calling them humans, let's call them people. Yeah. I think that's actually a really good, because I think that is exactly what we're talking about. You know, humans almost dehumanizes them weirdly. Yeah. But I think that's a really interesting differentiation because, I think it's very easy, isn't it, in the cybersecurity industry to talk about humans as kind of the weak point in our cybersecurity chain. You know, they are the risk to organizations. And while that's true, I think, if we look at cybersecurity and the people element of it, if we get that right, they go from being kind of potentially our biggest risk to our maybe our primary protection.
It's a potential point of enforcement. And I think, the language that says humans are the risk surface, that's not technically wrong. But I think about it, I'll phrase it this way. I've not spoken to a security operations person, a CISO at all, who said, I don't want people reporting phishing. Mostly, they say people aren't reporting enough phishing, but we will never give anybody grief if they think that there's a phishing email comes in and they report it and it turns out to be safe. We're not going to go and give them a hard time, right? No, so nobody in IT security operations thinks that. But in user land, people are concerned about, I don't want to waste their time. I don't want them to think badly of me. So there is this harmonization problem. I think there is, the people perceive there to be a gap. So the way in which we talk about it can help make that work together better.
And I think, and again, I think it's a really interesting point in there, and you're absolutely right in that I think in the ideal world, nobody in security operations is thinking that. Yeah. But I think that's an interesting, if you feel, if you're watching this and you feel that, actually, I wonder if that is the case. Do we do we appear unfriendly and harsh when it comes to cybersecurity? Yeah. It's probably a good conversation to have.
It's an interesting thought experiment. Like I said, no one said it to me that this is what they think, but I don't know what
Nobody's going to admit it.
I don't know what they're saying to their organization. I don't know what they're thinking in their quiet moments.
Yeah. But I think that whole thing around kind of culture is hugely important when we talk about humans. I think that idea of, we need to have this kind of almost warm and loving security environment where people can feel comfortable talking about, the idea that, maybe I've clicked on something that I shouldn't. If we don't have that ability for somebody to report something, whether that's click a button in your mail client, or whether that is, to make sure that the security team is actually not just approachable. And we talked about this on a podcast recently, and I thought it was a really interesting idea about making sure that as a technology team, you market yourself to the organization so that people know who you are, how to approach it. Is that actually something you're seeing changing in organizations? I know this wasn't something we was going to talk about. It's an interesting topic. So
I hadn't. Yeah. The short answer is yes. I think I am seeing that change. I think in the conversations I'm having with IT leaders, that is coming up more and more. The need. Actually, I don't even think it's a need. I think it's the recognition that how we market, internal marketing to the organization about what we do, and that we're not the department of saying no, or it's an enabler. IT is an enabler. Yeah, it only exists to enable things. So if it's getting in the way, then it's not enabling. And again, think about what happened. It wasn't just by COVID, but COVID accelerated the rise of consumer IT tools being deployed in the workplace. Yeah. Now, people were doing that because it's convenient and I needed to, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're an IT organization, that's in one way, it's a good thing. People are working and you're enabling, but it's also a bad thing because people are exposing themselves to new and different types of risk. If you just blanket say no, well, I'm afraid that horse has bolted, right? You can't blanket say no. So what you can do is work with the rest of the organization to introduce good practice, but good ways of thinking, and to collaborate to come up with the right position that makes sense for the organization.
I think we'll come back to that idea actually, because I think definitely a part of this is about how you educate. So how do we, and maybe the answer isn't perhaps the traditional way we've thought about doing some of this stuff. The idea that everybody sits down once a year and goes through some training videos maybe isn't the approach, but maybe we come back to that. But I think what you have done is actually led on nicely to one of the things I was going to ask you about, which was kind of how the threat is evolving. So, you've talked there about the way the workplace has evolved and the way our IT infrastructure has evolved. Yeah. So increasingly we're using cloud-based SaaS applications. Yeah. People are using we were talking before we started recording about consumer technology, and the way that's become a part of the modern workplace. What are, and interestingly, you talk about the risk that people maybe assume that people fall for, which is, I get an email with a link and I do some stuff. And maybe those emails are, if you just took a moment to read them, you think, well, this is clearly some kind of phishing attempt. Yeah. But that whole thing feels like it's evolved quite a lot, And so, what are you seeing in terms of the evolution of the way that, attacks are built, the anatomy of an attack almost?
Well, I think there's lots of things going on. One is that I promised myself I wouldn't say AI, but generative AI is playing a big part.
Now, contractually, we're obliged to talk about AI somewhere in a podcast.
Yes, so that's tick that box off. Right. So that is in the same way as I actually don't need any skills now. I can rent a ransomware kit, I can rent a phishing kit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need any skills now to generate convincing sounding content or to generate a lot of content. Yeah. And actually, the thing to remember is a lot of this is a volume game. So that's helping the adversaries generate better sounding content, different sounding content. So AI is playing a part in the scale at which people are being assaulted. The other theme, and you talked about then your consumerized technologies, but we've just released our State of Email Security Report, which is we now call it the State of Email and Collaboration Security Report. And the reason we've changed the name is because email's not going away. Email is still the biggest communications channel there. There's still lots of it, and it's growing. It's just that collaboration tools like Teams, Slack, etc., are growing at a faster rate. And that introduces a new risk because, I don't know about you, but I think most people interact differently.
Yep.
You're more informal in those communications. Heaven forbid we use WhatsApp for work communications, but it's a more informal, you said about less thinking, right? So I've got less thinking, I've got less filtering in those things. Yep. I've seen something in Teams, it looks like it's from Paul, right, boom, I'll go and do this. And then let's think about if I use Instagram or Facebook for work communications, if I use LinkedIn so a big, I don't know how big it is, but certainly something I've heard about different occasions is people are being attacked on LinkedIn by people posing as recruiters.
Yeah.
So how do you know that person saying, "Oh, I've got this great job for you. Do you want to give me your personal details?" Well, of course I do. I'd like a new job. If you watch your Mimecast, no, I wouldn't. But that's a way of lowering someone's guard.
Yeah.
Because I might have my guard up in my corporate Outlook email. My guard is less up in my LinkedIn world, but I'm the same person, and the adversaries are coming up with an omni-channel attack strategy.
Yeah, I mean, omni-channel is a great phrase, by the way. And I think you make some really good points in there as well about that kind of the way that we talk. I said almost in the introduction to that question that these threats aren't new, and we are used to. You talked about Gen AI, so Gen AI making it easier for a cyber attacker to build something that is a credible form of communication.
Yeah.
It's no longer the badly spelled, poorly grammared, prince from some country who's offering you a ton of money, or that dead relative that you didn't know you had who happened to be really, really rich. I'm still waiting for the money, by the way.
Yeah.
Share your bank details or give me $1,000 and you can have $1 million back, kind of thing. But actually, so while that is not the case necessarily with email, if you take a channel like Slack, or like you said, maybe if you're using WhatsApp for business communications, that those filters aren't necessarily the same. You might accept a poorly written, less grammatically correct, more casual piece of conversation on a comms platform, whatever that may, from Teams to Slack to WhatsApp. And I think that's a really interesting shift, because it kind of plays as well to that piece where, I think we're talking a little bit off air about this as well, that actually what cyber attackers are looking to do is just to kind of ease you away from your comfort zone a little bit.
Yes.
And this kind of, this amount of communications that we have and communication channels that we have that I think we're probably not very good at handling most of the time.
Yeah.
I kind of speaks to that point a lot, and I mean, is that part of that report you're talking about? You can see that kind of thing?
Yes, that is part of the report we're talking about, definitely seeing the increase in those communication channels and then the risk that organizations perceive from that. And one of the things there is you talk about, inviting people to switch channels. That's clearly an indicator of the potential for compromise, as is, and again, some of the channels, more mobile friendly channel introduces more urgency. And then as humans, we go, oh, Paul needs this and he needs this quickly. And so therefore my testing, my thinking, my critical thinking is going to be diminished because I need to do something quickly. And I'm doing it on my mobile and I don't have time. These are all things that if you step back, think about it, you go, oh yeah. But we don't do it in the moment. And that's what the bad guys are playing upon. They're playing upon the fact that people are basically nice. And people are basically trying to help one another.
Yes.
And that's how you take advantage of them.
So that actually leads on to, because that's a really interesting point as well. And it leads on to a couple of areas, I think. And I suppose maybe we'll start with that idea of this kind of, you pinch your phrase again, omni-channel. So this multiple channel approach, because one of the things I think is difficult in this kind of more human-centric threat landscape that I think we are operating in, is actually the complexity of spotting this kind of thing. Because spotting somebody going to a malicious website or a malicious domain and downloading a piece of, there's lots of well-established tools and practices, from something at the firewall level. And okay, so we can have the conversation about how the perimeter's changed. Let's just
that's a different podcast.
Exactly. That's a different show. So we part that for a moment. Let's assume you sat in your office, you click on something, you download it, your firewall picks up and goes, malicious content, let's block that.
Yes.
But actually this idea of moving around, makes makes a human threat really difficult to spot, because what you're actually looking for are people that you think you know and trust, potentially doing things across lots and lots of different platforms that all in themselves don't necessarily look like a risky activity, but put together looks like, actually I've encouraged you to move from Teams, which is something we've got an eye on, to WhatsApp, which is something that we don't. Is that something that you're seeing, and is that adding to the complexity that comes with human-centric security?
I think that's definitely something that is being seen. So adversaries are definitely trying to get that going, that they know that those security controls are in place, let's say at the perimeter. It's not just the perimeter, everyone's got better than that, but for simplicity. So they know the security controls are there. They know largely the security controls that people have got are quite good. So they're trying to move to places where the security controls are less good. But I want to invert the thinking a little bit here, because you're talking about posing the question as this is the risk piece. It's potentially also visibility and a point of enforcement now for how you as a security organization respond and react to this. Because if you can identify what people are doing that's different or novel or unusual, that doesn't necessarily tell you that something bad's happening, but it might give you better insight in where to start looking. So if you start seeing, a trivial example, if you can see, hey, Bob's just moving files from corporate Dropbox, which is fine, to what looks like Google Drive, which is unusual. Maybe we're working with a supply chain partner who uses Google Drive. Maybe he's just downloading a load of content to his personal account. Maybe I can't tell which it is, but that's a good place to go start looking. So it can give you, knowing that that's what adversaries are trying to do to encourage our people to do something bad, we can be looking for that to try and help them not do something bad.
And I think that's, I think you make a really good point, actually. And, maybe this is something to look at in terms of what is it that vendors are doing, because visibility is a huge part of that. We've already given a couple of examples of, Fred is doing something where he's moving data from, he's accessed data in SharePoint like he normally would, and now that data is moving to somewhere else. Or he's having communications that started on an email, it's moved to Teams, and then suddenly it's in WhatsApp. Actually being able to have visibility of that kind of movement feels like it's hugely important in trying to address some of these modern challenges. Is that something that vendors are starting to look at and look at this kind of problem maybe more holistically in terms of being able to find ways to join all of this stuff together?
I think there's a couple of things. One is, yes, people are trying to say, okay, can we join the dots from all of that individual communication chain? To a certain extent, I don't necessarily need to have a completely stitched together path if the outcome can be seen in the user behavior. So if I can see that people are doing something unusual, that might be my indicator rather than following the breadcrumbs to exactly how they're doing. Maybe that's the forensic analysis to say, okay, how did you get breached? How did you get compromised? Maybe the interesting question is, what's the quickest way of me spotting when something is happening? Actually, there's a second question, which is, could I, at the point at which someone's being incited to do something interesting? So if I see someone maybe click on a link that is being captured by my perimeter security, but maybe that's a point of education as well. Maybe as well as just blocking it, say, did you know? Did you know you've just done something that you didn't want to? Not from a slap in the wrist point of view, although that's how a lot of people will probably take it, but from the point of view of, okay, let's just remind you of some material. Let's just ask the question, are you sure you want to do this? Often that's enough. Are you sure you want to do this? Give someone that 30 seconds to pause and go, you know what? I nearly made a mistake there.
And I think that actually raises a good point as well in terms of almost the breadth of the approach is important. So, you've got the breadth of identification. And we've already kind of talked about that. Actually, this is quite difficult stuff to spot because we are thinking about humans. And, and not all of the kind of activities that present potential security threats are malicious. So a lot of them, you kind of talked about it before, actually, the idea of that people are nice in general. And actually, in general, most people in an organization are just trying to find ways to efficiently do their jobs. And that includes the things you talked about before. Well, I'm using a bit of consumer tech because it makes it easier for me to do my job. If I let me use ChatGPT because it makes it easier for me to do a lot of stuff potentially. Not necessarily well, but at least allows you to get to some bulk kind of activities. And so that kind of you talked about user behavior. How important a part is. We talked about a little bit about this before we started recording. The way that the vendor approach is starting to, and the market is starting to evolve instead of concentrating so much on. Traditionally we've all concentrated on, well, actually the way to do data security is how important is that data? Let's look at all of the data we've got. Let's classify it. Let's identify, well, this is really, really high risk. And if it's really, really high risk, we must do some stuff with it. And I'm not saying you don't continue to do those things. I think you need to. And then there's governance and legal framework reasons why you need to do some of that stuff. But actually from a risk point of view, that's not necessarily, because that's complicated and time consuming. And you touched on this idea of user behavior. And I think looking at the market that we're seeing this real kind of coming together of these two things. It's not so much while what's in the data is important to a degree because for some of the reasons we just talked about, but actually the way the data is being used is perhaps more important to identify potential risk. Is that an accurate view? Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, I think. Yes, if you talk about, I'll say, a classic traditional, what I learned in school about DLP, I go through and I classify and I tag all my assets, and I've got, first of all, I've got to identify my 5 levels of confidentiality or whatever it might be, and then I've got to decide how every asset, and I go through and I tag it all. It might be the case that on the day that I do that, everything's up to date and accurate. It might be. I'm going to say it probably isn't. The challenge for an organization is, how do I keep that up to date? Are the classifications that I designed 12 months ago, are they fit for purpose for the data I've got today? So that becomes an act in and of itself. And I think there's a huge risk that people will find themselves out of date, that the policy, either they can't implement and keep up to date with what they designed, or what they designed isn't suitable for what they need. And the risk with that, the bad thing about that is you think you're protected, but you're not, and that's actually probably the most damaging part of that. If you're out of it, but you're right. It's still probably for a certain class of data, for a certain class of organizations, it needs to be done. That's just because there are problems in getting it done doesn't mean we shouldn't try. But that's looking at it from the point of view of the data. A different way of thinking about this is then from the point of view of the data flows. So if I see that, Bob, my fictional Bob, is now moving some data from A to B, and A's a sanctioned place and B is a non-sanctioned place, I don't need to know what the data is that he's moving in order to be able to ask the question, should he be doing that? And so it's a combination of understand the data and the assets, but then understand the flows and the transports that are going on, possibly in the context of maybe Bob's not allowed to go to B, but Charlie is. Maybe Charlie's job, it's normal for him to go to. So that individual view of data transport, without necessarily knowing what the payload actually is, can be very revealing in where I should be looking for interesting things. And then it's just, I don't say it's almost probabilistic, but it just helps security operations know where to spend their time.
Yeah, and I think this idea of all of that I think is 100% accurate. And I'm working on something with somebody at the moment actually where that's the exact use case. In most cases, these people never need to see this data. But in some cases, this department over here does need to see that. So how do we build the controls and processes that identify that, allow it to happen, and then quickly spot when somebody is kind of working against. That's something anomalous is happening. So I think it's a really interesting area. But I think you kind of touched on something else before. And I think it's actually something that's maybe I'm partly responsible, not in general for everybody, but partly responsible in some conversations around this idea of educating users as well. So this kind of, I think it's kind of user education when it comes to security. So this kind of security training, etc. I think has developed a bit of a reputation. And I mean, part of my view now is that the organizations that use security training platforms believe wholly in security training platforms and believe everybody should have security training. People who don't just don't see the value of it, and actually convincing each side of that argument that there's legitimacy in either having it or not is really difficult. I think almost people are entrenched a little bit that I believe in it or I don't.
Yeah.
And if I don't, it's going to be really hard to convince me otherwise. But I think that's because often people have a view of security training, which is, a couple of times a year, we'll send out a phishing test and we'll make some people sit through videos, which may go from animated to serious to some kind of quirky thing that sits in between. But you touched on something before about this idea of almost just in time, almost real time education. Is that kind of an important shift that you're also seeing, that the value in how we make people kind of that front line of defense, a big part of that is just that kind of, I hear the phrase nudge type training quite a lot, just say, are you sure? Have Clippy pop up and say, you sure you want to do this?
So I think that's, I don't know that we're necessarily seeing it. Mimecast is actually trying to bring this about. So I think there's always the risk of fatigue in the user population of, I've got to go and do this, and it's a compliance exercise. And actually, for a lot of organizations, there is a compliance requirement. I am required to train my people. But there's also a question of, okay, what's effective? You mentioned phishing. We've got some indicative data. The nice thing, because Mimecast sees all the emails that comes into an organization, right? So we see not just how you respond to a phishing simulation, we also see how you respond to real phishing emails. Hopefully we block them, so we inoculate you against the impact of clicking on that, but we see the users, the people who do click. The interesting thing is that people's behavior for real phishing simulations, real phishing events, compared to their behavior in simulations, isn't strongly correlated. So I can't be confident that how someone responds to a simulation is a good predictor for how safe they'll be in the wild. We get to see both, so we can actually build a picture of Bob versus Alice versus Charlie versus Dave and individualize their risk profile. And then potentially work out, okay, does Dave need to go through the whole immersive experience again because his risk is quite significant? But for someone else, we might just the nudge at the point of interaction to say, you've just done this. Maybe we send you a Slack message when you do something in email that says, you need to think about this because this is a bit unusual. Nudge theory is getting very, very interesting. I think there's a lot of work going on around how nudge theory can be applied in cybersecurity to help people. Because what we do know is that a one-size-fits-all strategy probably isn't be the most effective for an organization.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that. And, and that kind of, whether it's nudge theory or maybe what you were talking about before as well, that idea of it's real time. So actually, as a thing's happening, let me take that as kind of, I'm going to hate myself for using this phrase now, a teachable moment. I apologize to myself and my family for using that phrase, and anybody who knows me, if you feel let down. But actually that idea of that just in time, I know we said Clippy, but it's almost the...
We're dating ourselves here, aren't we?
Yeah, it's almost the, he's going to come back. Clippy will be back one day. But it's also almost the Amazon approach, isn't it? People who did this also bought this. Yeah. So are you sure that this is the action you want to take? Do you know this is potentially risky?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of value in being able to do that.
Yes. And some of this, again, there's a question of, and there's people listening to this right now thinking, I can't possibly do that because anything that slows down the flow of activity is a problem. And that's a real challenge. And I think IT organizations, IT security people need to recognize that organizations do want to, speed is a big factor. So it may not be in line for a decision process. It may be near real time to say, okay, let's revisit that while it's fresh in your mind.
Yeah.
Within the 15 minutes after you did this,
while you're thinking about it.
Again, I'll run with it. Maybe it's still a teachable moment 15 minutes after the bad thing. 6 months after the bad thing, waste of time. You know, it's in my dim and distant memory. I didn't click on that link. Why are you talking to me? So, but at the point at which, I've just done this. Okay. Maybe I should interact with the content. I'm
impressed that it takes 6 months for them people to forget. I mean, if it was yesterday, I'd be going, "What? I did that yesterday? You sure?"
Yeah.
So let's let's talk more specifically about Mimecast then. You know, because obviously the point of the show is to kind of delve more specifically into how you're approaching this as a vendor.
Yeah.
So there's lots of things in here that I think the complexity of the problem, the breadth of how the problem exists, the amount of kind of the amount of kind of mitigation actions that you need to put in place. So so I think one of the appealing things about Mimecast, and and one of the reasons kind of we're having this chat, and I like talking to you guys, is that you've got that kind of breadth, you know, and you touched on it before. Actually, you can see these multiple touch points, these multiple threats, and build this kind of picture. So but for people who aren't necessarily familiar with how Mimecast might approach this, what are some of the things that you guys can do?
Yeah. So what most people will have seen, if you get 12,000 plus organizations in the UK use Mimecast to secure their email communications. So you'll see on the bottom of emails, maybe your organization sends or your supply chain and partners, customers send, say, secured by Mimecast. So we are probably best known for that. That we apply security controls to emails coming in and out of an organization. That's a great starting point, because we get to see the communications and inspect them for risky stuff. What we are complementing that with then is the ability to look at our data, which is a very rich source of data. And it's not just email, it's collaboration as well. And third-party sources of data. So what do we get from the firewall, or from the cloud security, or the web gateway, or whatever it might be? We can ingest lots and lots of that data and put it into a human risk engine to come up with that individual view of the risk profile for a person. Then we can, again, interact not just with Mimecast, but with all the rest of the security stack we can do a couple of things. One is we can interact with the rest of the security stack, potentially to apply some different controls on a different individual by individual basis. So, hey, look, you're a person and we know you've got access to these assets and they're considered quite risky, and we know that you've got a predilection to click on phishing links, and we've just seen you do something. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell the identity solution to re-authenticate you. We're going to revoke all your privileges. You need to re-authenticate before you can do anything potentially harmful. It's quite a straightforward action, but actually will have quite a high impact, because if you have been compromised, then hopefully they can't re-authenticate. So that's a simple use case. But it's also about, as we talked about, maybe the action isn't as severe as a policy control. Maybe it's just as straightforward as a nudge. Maybe it's as straightforward as, okay, you need to re-engage with some content to do this. So that's like a simplified view of what human risk can be. Aggregate a load of data from a load of sources, build that individual picture, and then provide the visibility into the organization, potentially interact with the user differently, potentially enforce different security controls. What we can also do with some technology we brought into the Mimecast family earlier this year is we can also look at those data flows that I was talking about earlier. So we can also look at what individual people are doing in terms of moving data across an organization, and we can bring that into the picture as well. So now I can see something about how you're being attacked, because I can see how your communications are being compromised, or bad stuff's being inserted into the communication coming to you. I can see how you're responding to that, and I can see how your data flows are working. So that's an extra rich source of data. In and of itself, it's great, because if I can provide that visibility that Bob's going to Google Drive with assets that he shouldn't have, I can enforce there just in and of itself. But I bring that into a picture that says, that joins this up with also everything else that we see. It's a very enriched picture. And one extra point I want to make of something you said earlier. There's two pieces, right? One is malicious insider stuff. So people willfully, I'm just about to quit, so why don't I download your customer database and take it with me? But there's also inadvertent insider threat. And it can be as simple as I'm trying to collaborate with my third party, and the quickest and easiest way for me to do that is to spin up some cloud storage and dump a load of files there. Well, I'm not an IT person, so I just do the default spinning up of the cloud storage, and guess what? The security controls there allow anybody with admin to, so it can be a case of an early warning for that. You've seen something happen. It's not that we want to stop it happening. Maybe we do, but probably we don't. We just want to make sure it's done securely.
Well, and I suppose that's the kind of that's that nudge idea as well, isn't it? Or that just-in-time piece that says, hey, we don't want to stop you doing this, but actually the company approach to doing this might be this thing over here, so go do that. And I think you made a load of really good points about that idea of context is hugely important.
Completely.
Because that kind of accidental versus malicious thing comes about because you've got context, so the ability to see, Mimecast can do this, the ability to see breadth of potential threat vectors, so we can look at lots of things, the ability to integrate with other platforms, so potentially I could look at HR system and say, is this a new starter, or is this somebody who's about to leave, or is this somebody maybe who's going through a disciplinary thing, and if they are, I can take that context, apply that to the user to say, actually this user is a higher risk potentially than this user. So while those two users are doing all the same activities, because this user's got some other things going on. And new starter is quite an interesting one. It wasn't an area I'd thought about particularly until somebody mentioned it to me maybe a year or so ago, about the idea that, well, new starters, you don't really know anything about them. You think you've done your due diligence, but you're never quite sure. So actually maybe for the first 6 months, they're a little bit of a higher risk, whatever it is they're doing, than somebody who isn't. So, and I think that's a big thing that Mimecast have got to think really is this idea of all of the context, and because context helps drive accuracy, because as we said before, I think we were talking about before we were recording, if you're not accurate doing this, you're just an annoyance, and in the end you become counterproductive because actually you're not very accurate, and why would I believe anything you tell me?
You get
hi ChatGPT.
Fatigue in the user population, in the rest of the organization, and cry wolf too many times kind of thing. But you're right, this is what we're doing now. This is the direction that we're going. This is going to evolve over the next 6, 12, 24 months. But the point here is thinking about both the risks to an organization, but the way in which we respond and how you can stitch together or actually extract more value from the security stack that's already there effectively. Think about it in a slightly different way. Think about it in a more individualized way against the people. Take advantage of, okay, what do we know about them and the access and data that they've got? What do we see about the way in which they're being attacked? And what do we know about how they respond? Take those three things together, build a picture, and then build a different set of responses and possibly controls for that person, not just a blanket set of controls that one size that won't fit anybody.
And I think it's hugely important if you're listening to this, a CTO or decision maker or somebody in security operations, that you've got a vendor who can deliver those things. So from offering protection at a base level, being able to understand context. So what is this user doing? What are they doing it with? And does that present a risk? Because risk, I think you talked about this kind of human risk management. How do we deal with that kind of risk? And then having the ability to do something about it. Nobody necessarily wants a platform that just tells them there's a problem. They'd like a platform that helps them to do that. So, Mimecast absolutely are a vendor who has this kind of breadth. So people watching this and thinking, well, do you know what? I could do with understanding this better. I could understand doing a little bit more about what Mimecast do. What's good ways for them to do that? How can they learn more about Mimecast? And is there some things they can do to engage with Mimecast early on?
I'd say the first thing, and possibly the easiest thing, is just what we call threat assessment. You can contact Gardner for this, and we can work together on looking at what's in your system right now, where the threats are, so we can find out, Are there attacks that you don't even know about yet that's going on? What's the vulnerability?
This includes some retrospective stuff as well.
Yes.
You can also look back at what's been going on over a period.
We can. So basically, we just go in, we look at what's it in people's mailboxes and say this actually got delivered, and it is or isn't risky. So we can do that, and that can help shine a light on maybe some dark corners that might be worrying. Things that need to get addressed and remediated in the short term.
And you can do that for free, can't you?
Yes. That's something we can do relatively easily, certainly at no cost to the organisation. And the second thing would be engaging that broader conversation. So we happy to talk about, okay, on a organisation by organisation basis, what does this mean? What would a human risk management journey look like?
Yeah.
And I wouldn't want to give anybody the impression that human risk management is something you buy and you implement and it's done. And we're at the end of October now. Buy it and you'll be done by the end of November and tick. The way to think about this is it's a journey.
Yeah,
it's a. I don't want to say it's a lifestyle choice, but it is definitely
it's an evolving thing, though.
It is an evolving thing.
The conversation we're having today, we wouldn't have had 2 years ago.
No, not at all. And I think it's an evolving thing. Like I say, over the last 5 years, I think maybe longer, what we've focused on as cybersecurity vendors and professionals is increasing controls. We're not increasing controls at the gateway, at the perimeter anymore, but we're just trying to tighten the security controls to stop that bad stuff getting into our organization, getting in front of our people. And we'll always keep improving that, and that's true. But I think this extra dimension of, okay, ask the question, what if the bad stuff was in front of the person? What if the bad actor was in front of the person in my organization? How do we help them not do the bad thing? And how do we get visibility into the organization when someone is at the point of doing the bad thing? I think spending some time there will bring significant benefits to an overall security posture of an organization.
Well, Malcolm, look, this has been great. I've learned a lot in this conversation. I think it is a hugely kind of evolving and very dynamic field. This kind of idea around human risk. But I think it's important that is how we start to think about security. It's looking at the behaviour and the risk that it presents. And absolutely parts in there about we need to have security. We need perimeter security wherever the perimeter might be. We need all those things. But actually, we this conversation around security actually being a risk problem. So where are the risks? Because we can't stop everything all of the time.
We can't.
And we need to be able to apply controls that don't stop everybody doing their job, which is I think is where risk comes in. So, well, Malcolm, it's been great. Really appreciate your time. And appreciate Mimecast joining us today to kind of share some of these insights you guys have got.
My pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, if that kind of threat assessment and looking and getting a little bit of an understanding of potential risk in your organisation appeals to you, then we're going to pop a link in the show notes where you can get in touch with us, and we'll set those things up. We might have even, if we've been really clever, put a link across the bottom of the screen. But I don't know. I can't see that right now. So maybe that's a thing. Maybe it isn't. But it'll definitely be in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's show and have got any comments about it, do please leave comments. And if you want to make sure you catch other future CTO Insights podcasts, then do subscribe. You can subscribe here on YouTube, and you can subscribe in all good homes of podcasts. But until next time, Malcolm, appreciate your time. Thanks for watching.